The Willamette River ran wild that Sunday afternoon in late May, its waters swollen and angry from weeks of mountain snowmelt pouring down from the Cascade Range. The current churned brown and violent, carrying broken branches, torn vegetation and debris from upstream communities that had seen heavy rainfall throughout the week. Along the rocky shoreline near Eugene's Skinner Butte Park, families had gathered to enjoy the first truly warm weekend after a long, wet spring. Children played on the rocks, couples spread blankets on the grass, and the smell of grilling food drifted through the air. Nobody seemed particularly concerned about the river's dangerous conditions, despite the warning signs posted at regular intervals along the bank. Rebecca Peterson stood near the water's edge, unpacking sandwiches from a worn canvas bag while keeping one eye on her 4-year-old son, Danny. He crouched among the smooth river stones, his red plastic bucket forgotten beside him, as he examined each rock with intense concentration, searching for the perfect specimens to add to his collection. Rebecca had promised him they'd find the best skipping stones in all of Oregon, though the river's current state made that promise seem foolish now. The water was moving too fast for stone skipping, too dangerous for anything except admiration from a safe distance. But Danny didn't understand danger the way adults did. To him, the rushing water was just noise, the rocks were treasures, and the afternoon was perfect. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us. Rebecca's husband James had taken their 9-year-old daughter Lily to a soccer tournament in Portland, leaving Rebecca and Danny to create their own adventure for the day. She'd suggested the park, thinking it would be a safe, easy outing, a chance to let Danny burn off some energy while she relaxed in the sunshine. Now, watching the river's violent current, she wondered if they should have stayed home. But Danny was happy, chattering to himself as he sorted stones, and the day was beautiful despite the water's mood. Rebecca had grown up along these rivers, had learned to swim in waters just as cold and unforgiving as this. Her father had been adamant about water safety, taking her to every swimming hole and river within 50 miles, teaching her to respect the current, to understand how moving water worked, to never panic even when conditions turned dangerous. Those lessons had seemed excessive at the time, her father's paranoia about drowning almost comical in its intensity. But he'd lost his own brother to the Willamette when they were teenagers, and that loss had shaped everything about how he raised Rebecca. "Not too close, sweetie," Rebecca called out, her voice carrying over the water's roar. Danny nodded without looking up, his entire focus on a particularly interesting stone wedged between two larger boulders. He reached for it, his small sneaker sliding slightly on the wet rocks. Rebecca felt her heart skip, but Danny caught himself, laughing at his own clumsiness before reaching again with more care. The stone came free, and he held it up triumphantly, examining it in the sunlight. Rebecca smiled and returned her attention to the sandwiches, pulling out the peanut butter and jelly she'd made that morning, the apple slices already turning slightly brown despite the lemon juice she'd squeezed over them. She heard Danny's footsteps on the rocks, assumed he was moving away from the water's edge, didn't look up until she heard the splash. It wasn't a big splash, wasn't the sound of a body hitting water. It was smaller than that, just the sound of a foot going in, a shoe getting wet. But when Rebecca's head snapped up, Danny was already off balance, already tilting forward, already beyond the point where he could catch himself. His other foot slipped on the wet stones, and then he was falling, tumbling into the brown water with a shock of surprise on his small face. For one frozen moment, Rebecca couldn't process what she was seeing. Her brain refused to accept that Danny was in the water, that the river had grabbed him, that he was already being swept away. Then Danny screamed, a high, terrified shriek that cut through every other sound, and Rebecca's body responded before her mind fully understood what was happening. She dropped the sandwiches and ran. Her shoes pounded against the rocks, her arms pumping, her eyes locked on Danny's blue jacket as the current pulled him downstream with shocking speed. He was already 20 feet away, already 30, his small arms flailing as he tried to fight the water. Rebecca didn't slow down when she reached the edge. She didn't hesitate or consider the danger, or think about the water's temperature or the current's strength. There was only Danny, only the impossible distance between them growing wider with each passing second, only the absolute necessity of reaching him before the river pulled him under and kept him there forever. She launched herself into the water in a flat, racing dive, the kind her father had taught her decades ago, designed to cover maximum distance with minimum splash. The cold was a physical assault, worse than anything Rebecca had experienced in years. The Willamette in late May was pure mountain snowmelt, 48 degrees on a warm day, cold enough to stop hearts and paralyze muscles and kill within minutes. It drove every molecule of air from Rebecca's lungs and made her diaphragm seize in shock. Her first instinct was to gasp, to suck in air reflexively, but she was underwater, and gasping would mean drowning. She fought the impulse and kicked hard, breaking the surface with her lungs screaming for oxygen. The cold had already sunk into her bones, making her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. She forced her arms to move, forced her legs to kick, forced her body to swim despite every cell screaming at her to stop, to get out, to escape the cold. Danny was ahead of her, maybe 40 feet downstream now, his blue jacket the only bright spot in the murky brown water. Rebecca could see his face when he surfaced between waves, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in continuous screams that the river swallowed. He went under, came up coughing and gasping, went under again. The current was pulling him toward the center of the river where the water ran deepest and fastest, where the real danger lurked beneath the surface. Submerged logs, hidden rocks, underwater currents that could trap and hold a body indefinitely. Rebecca angled her swimming, trying to intercept his path rather than chase directly behind him. The current was too strong for a direct pursuit. She had to think, had to use the water's movement to her advantage rather than fighting against it. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, instructions delivered during countless swimming lessons. The current is stronger than you are. Don't fight it head on. Work with it. Angle across. Use its energy. Rebecca adjusted her stroke, swimming at a diagonal that would hopefully intercept Danny's trajectory. The shoreline blurred past, the picnic area, other families now running and shouting, the warning signs she'd barely noticed earlier. Her arms burned with effort. Her lungs couldn't seem to get enough oxygen no matter how deeply she breathed. The cold was eating through her muscles, making each stroke harder than the last, but she was gaining on Danny. The angle was working. 40 feet became 30, became 20. A massive submerged log appeared ahead, its dark form just visible beneath the surface, its branches reaching up like skeletal fingers waiting to grab and hold. Danny didn't see it. He was too small, too focused on trying to keep his head above water, too terrified to look ahead. He hit the log hard, his small body slamming into the solid wood with an impact Rebecca could hear even over the river's roar. For one terrible moment, she thought he'd be pushed under the log, trapped beneath the surface where she'd never reach him in time. But the current pushed him up and over instead, spinning his body like a rag doll before releasing him on the downstream side. And that's when Rebecca's hand finally, blessedly, closed around his jacket. She pulled him to her chest with desperate strength, wrapping one arm completely around his small body, while she used the other to swim. Danny clutched at her, his fingers digging into her shirt, his whole body shaking with violent shivers and sobs. "Mama," he gasped between coughs that brought up river water. "Mama, I'm scared. I can't breathe. Mama." His voice dissolved into more coughing, more water expelled from his lungs, more terrified crying. Rebecca wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything was okay, but she needed her breath for swimming, because having Danny wasn't enough. They were both in the water now, both being swept downstream at frightening speed, both in mortal danger from the cold and the current and the obstacles hidden beneath the surface. Rebecca kicked toward the shore, but it was like trying to swim through concrete. The current pulled them relentlessly downstream, indifferent to her efforts, indifferent to their desperate need to escape. For every foot she gained toward the bank, the river pulled them 10 feet farther down. The shoreline here offered nothing, just steep banks lined with rocks and fallen trees, no gentle beaches, no boat ramps, no convenient places to pull themselves out. Rebecca's arms were going numb. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, responding sluggishly to her brain's commands. The cold was winning. She could feel it in the way her thoughts were starting to scatter, in the way colors seemed too bright and sounds too distant. Hypothermia was setting in fast, faster than she'd expected, and once it took hold completely, she wouldn't be able to swim anymore. She wouldn't be able to save Danny. They'd both drown, locked together, and James would lose his whole family in one terrible afternoon. The thought of James finding out, of him getting that phone call, of him having to tell Lily that her mother and brother were dead, gave Rebecca a surge of desperate strength. She would not let that happen. She would not give up. Danny needed her. Her family needed her. She kicked harder, pulled more strongly with her free arm, searched the shoreline ahead for anything that might help. And there, maybe 60 yards downstream, she saw it. A massive oak tree had fallen from the bank into the river, its trunk extending a third of the way across the water, its branches creating a natural barrier against the current. If she could reach it, if she could grab hold of one of those branches before the current swept them past, they might have a chance. Rebecca adjusted her angle again, aiming for the tree. 60 yards became 50, became 40. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges, the first sign that her brain wasn't getting enough oxygen, that the cold was affecting her cognitive function. She blinked hard, trying to clear her sight, trying to focus. Danny had gone quiet in her arms, his sobs fading to whimpers, and that terrified Rebecca more than his screaming had. Quiet meant he was giving up, meant the cold and fear and exhaustion were overwhelming him. "Stay with me, baby," she gasped. "Stay awake. Keep talking to me." But Danny didn't respond, just pressed his face against her shoulder and shivered. The tree was close now, close enough that Rebecca could see the individual branches, could identify which one might be strong enough to hold them. A thick limb extended over the water at shoulder height, its surface worn smooth by the river's constant assault. Rebecca aimed for it with the last of her strength, kicking with legs that barely responded, pulling with an arm that had gone almost completely numb. 20 feet, 15, 10. The current tried to push them past, but Rebecca made one final desperate lunge, reaching out with her free hand, her fingers closing around the branch just as the water tried to sweep them away. The impact jarred her entire body. Her shoulder slammed into the wood, sending pain shooting down her arm and across her chest. But she held on. The current immediately tried to tear them away, pulling at their legs with tremendous force, trying to pry Rebecca's frozen fingers from the branch. The wood creaked and bent under their combined weight, dipping lower into the water. But it held. It held. Rebecca wrapped her arm more securely around the branch, then adjusted her grip on Danny, pulling him higher against her chest, trying to keep his head well above the water. "Help!" she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "Somebody help us, please!" On the shore, people were running toward them. Rebecca could see them through her blurred vision. A man in a yellow shirt leading the way, a woman with a phone pressed to her ear shouting into it frantically, several others following behind. But they were still 50 feet away, still on dry land, still separated from Rebecca and Danny by cold, violent water. The branch creaked again, and Rebecca felt it dip lower. It wouldn't hold forever. The wood was old, waterlogged, weakened by years of exposure to the river's assault. She could feel it beginning to bend more dramatically, could hear new sounds of stress coming from where it connected to the trunk. "Please," she called again, though her voice was weaker now, her strength fading fast. "Please hurry!" The man in yellow reached the water's edge and immediately waded in, not hesitating despite the obvious danger. Another man followed him, and together they formed a human chain, the second man holding onto a tree on the bank while the first pushed out into the current. The water shoved against their legs, trying to knock them down, but they were bigger and stronger and more stable than Rebecca. They moved slowly but steadily, fighting for each step, getting closer with agonizing slowness. Rebecca's fingers were losing feeling. She couldn't tell anymore if she was holding the branch or if her hand had simply frozen in that position. Danny was a dead weight in her other arm, not moving, not responding when she said his name. Terror spiked through her exhaustion. Was he still breathing? Was he conscious? She couldn't tell. She couldn't move enough to check. The men reached the tree, reached for Danny with gentle but urgent hands. "Let him go, ma'am," the one in yellow said, his voice kind despite the urgency. "We've got him. You have to release him so we can get him to shore." Rebecca's brain understood the words, but her body wouldn't obey. Her arm was locked around Danny, frozen in place, unwilling or unable to let go. "Ma'am," the man said again, more firmly, "you have to trust us. We'll take care of him, but you need to let go." Somehow, Rebecca forced her arm to open. She felt Danny's weight leave her, felt the men lifting him away, and it was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than jumping into the river. Harder than swimming through the current. Harder than holding onto the branch while the water tried to tear them away. She watched through hazy eyes as they passed Danny to other hands on the shore. Watched him being wrapped in someone's jacket. Watched people gathering around him. Then hands were on her too, pulling her from the branch, supporting her weight as they guided her through the water. Rebecca's legs didn't work anymore. She couldn't feel her feet, couldn't make her knees bend properly. The men half carried, half dragged her to shore and laid her on the rocky beach. Immediately people surrounded her, draping blankets over her shaking body, rubbing her arms and legs to stimulate circulation, asking questions she couldn't answer because her teeth were chattering too violently to form words. "Is he breathing?" Rebecca finally managed to force out. "Danny, is he—" "He's breathing, ma'am," someone assured her. "He's conscious. He's going to be okay." Sirens cut through the air, growing louder as emergency vehicles approached. Rebecca turned her head and saw Danny a few feet away, wrapped in multiple jackets, surrounded by people trying to keep him warm. His eyes were open. He was crying, reaching for her, calling out, "Mama!" in a voice that broke her heart. "I'm here, baby," she tried to say, but wasn't sure if the words came out loud enough for him to hear. Someone was telling her to stay still, to conserve her energy. But Rebecca didn't care about energy or stillness or anything except Danny being alive and breathing and safe on solid ground. An ambulance pulled up nearby, its red lights flashing against the afternoon sky, and paramedics jumped out with practiced efficiency. One went immediately to Danny while another knelt beside Rebecca, opening a medical kit and pulling out equipment. "Ma'am, I'm David, a paramedic. Can you tell me your name?" "Rebecca," she managed through chattering teeth. "Rebecca Peterson. That's my son, Danny. Is he really okay? Are you sure he's okay?" David took her pulse while asking questions. Was she in pain? Could she feel her hands and feet? Did she lose consciousness at any point? Rebecca answered automatically, her eyes never leaving Danny. The other paramedic was checking him over thoroughly, listening to his chest, looking in his mouth and nose, testing his responses. Danny was still crying, still calling for her, and the sound of his voice was the most beautiful thing Rebecca had ever heard. More emergency vehicles arrived, a fire truck, 2 police cars, their presence transforming the quiet riverbank into a scene of controlled chaos. Someone was marking off the area with yellow tape. Someone else was taking statements from witnesses. The man in the yellow shirt was describing the rescue to a police officer, his hands shaking as he recounted how close it had been, how he'd thought they were going to lose both of them. Rebecca caught pieces of other conversations, people talking about how fast it happened, how brave she was, how terrifying it must have been. But she didn't feel brave. She felt cold and scared and grateful beyond words that Danny was alive. David wrapped Rebecca in aluminum warming blankets and started an IV line for fluids. "We need to get you both to the hospital," he explained. "Your core body temperatures are dangerously low. You're both at serious risk for hypothermia-related complications." Rebecca nodded, not really processing the words, just understanding that they were going to the hospital and Danny would be there with her. The paramedics loaded Danny into the ambulance first, placing him on a small stretcher and securing him with straps. He fought them, screaming for Rebecca, his small face red and terrified. "Mama! Don't leave me! Mama!" The sound of his panic gave Rebecca strength she didn't know she still had. She pushed past David's protests and climbed into the ambulance before anyone could stop her. She wasn't leaving Danny alone. Not after everything. Not ever again. David exchanged a glance with his partner but didn't argue. They helped Rebecca onto a bench seat and wrapped her in more warming blankets, placed an oxygen mask over her face, adjusted the IV flow. Danny was close enough that Rebecca could reach out and touch his hand, and she did, holding on to him like a lifeline. The ambulance doors closed, and they pulled away from the riverbank, sirens wailing, leaving behind the crowd of witnesses and the river that still churned brown and indifferent to the drama that had unfolded in its current. Rebecca closed her eyes and focused on the warmth of Danny's hand, on the steady beep of the monitors, on the feeling of safety that came from being in professional hands. They were out of the river. They were being cared for. Everything else could wait. Sacred Heart Medical Center was 12 minutes away through Sunday afternoon traffic, but it felt like hours. Every bump in the road sent jolts of pain through Rebecca's bruised shoulder where she'd hit the branch. Every breath still hurt, a tight burning sensation in her chest that made her wonder if she'd aspirated water during the rescue. But Danny was here, visible, his chest rising and falling with each breath. The paramedics talked quietly to each other, monitoring vitals, calling ahead to the ER with updates, using medical terminology Rebecca didn't fully understand. She heard words like hypothermia, near drowning, observation, pediatric protocol. None of it mattered as much as the fact that Danny was alive and breathing, and would soon be in a hospital where doctors could make sure he stayed that way. The ER team was ready when they arrived, moving with coordinated efficiency that spoke of extensive training and experience. They wheeled Danny out first, immediately surrounded by nurses and doctors who began their assessment even as they moved down the hallway. Rebecca followed on her own stretcher, trying to keep Danny in sight, reaching out toward him even as they rolled in different directions. "Please, I need to stay with him," she begged the nurse walking beside her. "He's scared. He needs me." The nurse's expression was sympathetic but firm. "The doctors need to examine you both separately. I promise we'll get you back together as soon as possible." They wheeled Rebecca into a curtained bay and immediately began their work, stripping off her wet clothes, wrapping her in heated blankets, taking blood pressure and temperature, asking the same questions David had asked in the ambulance. Through the wall, Rebecca could hear Danny crying, could hear gentle voices trying to soothe him, and it took every ounce of willpower she possessed not to tear off the monitoring equipment and run to him. A doctor appeared, an older woman with silver hair and calm gray eyes that had seen countless emergencies. "Mrs. Peterson, I'm Dr. Angela Reeves. I need you to take some deep breaths for me while I listen to your lungs." She placed a stethoscope against Rebecca's back, moving it to different positions while Rebecca breathed as instructed. "Good. I'm not hearing any signs of water in your lungs, which is excellent. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Rebecca recounted the events as best she could, though her memories were already becoming fragmented. Pieces of terror and cold and desperate swimming that didn't quite fit together in chronological order. Dr. Reeves listened carefully, taking notes, asking occasional clarifying questions. "You did exactly the right things," she said when Rebecca finished. "Your swimming ability and your understanding of how to handle yourself in current saved both your lives. Now, we need to make sure there are no complications from the cold water exposure." Time became strange in that curtained ER bay. Nurses came and went, bringing warm blankets and sweet tea Rebecca couldn't really taste, checking monitors and adjusting IV drip rates, offering reassurances that felt both genuine and routine. Rebecca drifted in and out of full awareness, not quite sleeping, but not fully present either, her mind replaying those terrible moments in the river on an endless loop. Through the wall, she could still hear Danny, his crying gradually subsiding to occasional whimpers, and she focused on that sound like an anchor to reality. As long as she could hear him, he was alive. As long as he was making noise, he was breathing. Those were the only facts that mattered. "Mrs. Peterson?" Dr. Reeves was back, holding a tablet with what looked like test results. "Your core temperature is coming up nicely. You're responding well to warming. I'd like to keep you for observation overnight, but I don't see any signs of serious complications. You're going to be sore for a few days, and you'll probably develop some bruising where you hit that branch. But overall, you're remarkably healthy considering what you've been through." Rebecca nodded, barely processing the medical information. "Danny," she said. "I need to see Danny, please." Dr. Reeves smiled. "I just spoke with Dr. Patel, who's been examining your son. He's doing well. Better than we might have expected, actually. Would you like to see him now?" Rebecca was up before the question was fully asked, her legs shaky but functional, her whole body trembling with more than just cold. Dr. Reeves steadied her, and together they walked down a hallway that seemed impossibly long, past other curtained bays where other dramas were unfolding, until they reached a room where Danny lay in a bed that looked far too big for his small body. He was surrounded by monitors and equipment, wires and tubes connecting him to machines that beeped softly in the quiet space. But his eyes were open, and when he saw Rebecca, they lit up with joy and relief. "Mama!" She went to him immediately, gathering him into her arms as carefully as the medical equipment would allow, feeling his warmth, his solid realness, his beautiful alive heartbeat against her chest. He wrapped his small arms around her neck and held on tight, his body still shaking with occasional shivers but warm, so wonderfully warm compared to how he'd felt in the river. Dr. Patel, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, stood nearby with a chart. "He's doing remarkably well," she said. "His oxygen saturation is normal, his lungs sound clear, and his core temperature has returned to safe levels. We're going to keep him overnight for observation. There's always a risk of secondary drowning or delayed hypothermia complications, but I'm optimistic about his recovery." Rebecca nodded, tears streaming down her face now that the adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving nothing but exhaustion and overwhelming relief. She couldn't speak, couldn't find words adequate to express what she was feeling. Danny was alive, he was okay, everything else was details. They were moved to a shared room where they could stay together, where Rebecca could keep her hand on Danny every moment of the night, reassuring herself that he was real and safe and breathing. A nurse brought dinner, soup and crackers and juice, though neither of them had much appetite. Rebecca's mother called, having heard somehow about the accident, her voice frantic with worry, until Rebecca assured her they were both fine. Her husband James was on his way back from Portland, driving faster than he should, desperate to see his family. The room gradually filled with the sounds of a hospital at night. Monitors beeping, announcements over the PA system, footsteps in the hallway, the murmur of staff voices discussing other patients. Danny fell asleep around 8 o'clock, exhausted by his ordeal, his small body curled against Rebecca's side in the hospital bed. She lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the rescue. What if she'd been looking away when Danny slipped? What if she hadn't been able to swim strongly enough to reach him? What if that branch hadn't been there? What if the men on shore hadn't been able to reach them in time? The what-ifs threatened to overwhelm her, an endless cascade of alternate realities where things ended differently, where she came home without her son, where she had to tell James that she'd failed to save their child. She held Danny tighter, feeling his steady breathing, reminding herself that this was reality. He was alive. He was safe. The nightmare was over. A nurse came in around midnight to check vitals, moving quietly in the darkened room, her presence somehow comforting. "You did good, Mama," she whispered to Rebecca. "You saved your boy's life. That takes serious courage." Rebecca wanted to say it wasn't courage. It was just instinct, just a mother doing what any mother would do. But that wasn't quite true either. Not every mother could have done what she did. Not everyone had the swimming skills, the understanding of river currents, the physical strength to fight hypothermia and exhaustion long enough to reach safety. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Preparation isn't paranoia. It's love. He'd prepared her for this moment without either of them knowing it, had given her the skills she needed to save her son's life, had loved her enough to teach her things she'd resented learning. She wished he was still alive so she could thank him, so she could tell him that his paranoia about water safety had saved his grandson's life. The night passed slowly, marked by regular checks from nursing staff and the constant quiet beeping of monitors. Rebecca dozed occasionally but never truly slept, her body too wired with adrenaline, her mind too busy replaying events. Danny slept more soundly, his small body finally able to rest now that he was warm and safe. Rebecca watched him sleep, memorizing the curve of his cheek, the flutter of his eyelashes, the rise and fall of his chest with each precious breath. She'd come so close to losing him. Feet. Seconds. That's all that had separated Danny from drowning. Feet of distance, seconds of time. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, a weight she knew she'd carry forever. Morning came with sunshine through the hospital windows and a visit from Dr. Reeves and Dr. Patel, both looking fresh and professional despite the early hour. They examined Rebecca and Danny thoroughly, checking lung sounds, taking temperatures, asking detailed questions about how they felt. "I'm pleased with both of your recoveries," Dr. Reeves announced. "Danny, you're a very lucky little boy. Your mama is very brave." Danny nodded solemnly, his hand tight in Rebecca's. "She saved me," he said in his small, serious voice. "The water was scary, but Mama got me." Dr. Patel smiled and ruffled his hair gently. "That's right. And now we're going to make sure you're completely healthy before you go home. Can you take some deep breaths for me?" They were discharged late morning with instructions for follow-up care and warnings about symptoms to watch for. James arrived as they were getting ready to leave, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red from crying or lack of sleep or both. He gathered Danny into his arms first, holding him so tight the boy squeaked in protest, then pulled Rebecca into the embrace as well. "I should have been there," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have stayed home. I should have—" Rebecca cut him off with a kiss. "You couldn't have known. Nobody could have known. What matters is we're okay. We're all okay." But even as she said it, she knew things weren't okay. Not really. They were alive, but they were changed. The river had marked them, had shown them how fragile life was, how quickly everything could be lost. The drive home was quiet, Danny asleep in his car seat before they'd even left the hospital parking lot. Rebecca sat in the back beside him, her hand on his chest, feeling each breath, unable to stop touching him, unable to convince herself he was truly safe. James kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. When they pulled into their driveway, Rebecca was surprised to see several cars parked on the street. Inside, the house was full of people. Rebecca's mother, who must have driven through the night, James's parents who'd come from the coast, their neighbors who'd heard the news and brought food. The kitchen counters were covered with casseroles and baked goods, the refrigerator had been stocked, and cards and flowers filled every available surface. People wanted to talk, wanted to hear the story, wanted to express their relief and gratitude that everyone was safe. Rebecca did her best to be gracious, to accept their concern and kindness, but all she really wanted was quiet, was space, was time to process what had happened without an audience. Eventually, James understood and gently ushered everyone out, promising updates and thanking them for their support. By early evening, only Rebecca's mother remained, settling into the guest room, insisting she'd stay as long as they needed her help. They ate dinner together, soup someone had brought, bread from the bakery down the street, and tried to find some semblance of normalcy. Danny seemed remarkably resilient, chattering about the hospital and the nice nurses and the cool machines, treating his near-death experience like an adventure now that it was safely in the past. But Rebecca noticed the way he stayed close to her, how his hand kept reaching for hers, how he flinched when James turned on the kitchen faucet and water rushed out. The trauma was there, hidden beneath his resilient exterior, waiting to manifest in nightmares and fears and behaviors they'd have to help him work through. That night, Rebecca lay in her own bed with Danny between her and James, all of them unwilling to be separated. Through the window she could hear ordinary sounds, traffic, the neighbor's dog, someone's television playing too loud, the soundtrack of their normal life. But nothing felt normal anymore. Everything had changed in those terrible minutes in the river. Rebecca had looked death in the face and fought it back, had won her son's life through strength and skill and desperate determination. The victory should feel triumphant, but all she felt was grateful and shaken and hyper-aware of how fragile everything was, how quickly their whole world could be destroyed. Danny stirred in his sleep, pressing closer to her warmth, and Rebecca wrapped her arms around him, breathing in the clean scent of the baby shampoo James had used for his bath. This was real. This was what mattered. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, fears to face, trauma to process, lessons to learn. But tonight, Danny was breathing, warm and safe between his parents, and that was enough. That was everything.